Всем добрый вечер. Мы рады приветствовать вас в нашем офисе ACCA. И сегодня у нас будет мероприятие по финансовым расследованиям. Мероприятие будет на английском языке. Я сразу предупреждаю, что вопросы тоже желательно задавать на английском. Я с удовольствием представляю наших спикеров: Джонатан Браун, FCCA, Наби Абдуллаев и Олег Козлов.
Hello, my name is Oleg. I work for control risks as a forensic consultant for Russia and CIS, dealing with corporate crime, compliance assessments, and so on. Previously, I worked for Big Four forensic department. That's John, and I let him introduce himself.
Thank you. So, John Brown, I'm the partner for forensics for control risks based in London. Apologies, obviously, it's me that's making this presentation be in English today, so sorry about that. I head the team that covers the region Europe, Middle East, Africa. We have teams across that region, including in Russia. Team is about 50 people, primarily forensic accountants. I'm FCCA, ACCA. Oleg, you are also, and a lot of people within our team are forensic accountants. Alongside that, we have a forensic technology team that collect data, but we'll talk about that in a bit more detail. Before being at Control Risks, I was at a Big Four firm alongside Oleg for 10 years. And prior to that, I was at the Serious Fraud Office in London.
Okay, so our today's presentation will cover issues related to forensic investigations, and also in the end we'll hand over to our business intelligence director, who will talk you through due diligence questions. So this is our plan for today, and hopefully you're not the guy on the picture, but that's the fraudster who just realized he committed some fraud. So we'll give a little introduction about basics, what is forensics, what is fraud, and so on. We'll also present you some interesting statistics about fraud generally worldwide. Then we'll talk more about tools and how to investigate crime. We also have case study, and as I said, we'll go on to due diligence questions. So before I actually start, I see a couple of familiar faces, but anyway, have anyone worked as a forensic accountant before? Raise your hands. As an investigator. Good, good. Has anyone worked with forensic consultants as consultants? Any experience you have? How was it? Good experience, bad? They helped? Okay, okay. Well, that happens quite sometimes. Yes, we just confirm what you already know. But anyway, so before I jump in, can anyone say what is forensic accounting? Like, very generally. You can, I think.
You don't need to take into consideration the materiality, but you need to just dig into the case and the nature of the case, and to see if the object or the target or the transaction. Да я вроде громко говорю, да? Хорошо. Может, на русский перейти? Все вроде русские, кроме одного джентльмена.
Конечно, можно.
Все-таки давно не практиковал. Вот. Соответственно, смысл экспертизы заключается в том, чтобы разобраться, насколько транзакция или же там, объект проверки отклонился от процедуры, от регламента, и сделал ли он это умышленно или за низкой компетенцией. То есть вот как бы так определить.
Yeah, thanks. That really covers the point. We will start here with very basic definition where it came from. It actually came from there. That's a forum, and that's in the root of this word, because forensic came from Latin, meaning in open court, public, and basically forensic really is translated related to court in English. Anything related to court. That's very on the basic ground. But then, if we're talking about forensic accounting, this covers accounting related to legal issues, which is a simple definition, and you have a more academic definition on the slide, examining past financial data for legal disputes, if we narrow it down to the very basic again. But forensic accounting can be also used not for litigation, but for internal purposes of the client in fraud investigations, and sometimes we start not realizing that it could end in the court, but it then ends, and vice versa as well. So what is fraud? Can anyone say? That is it. In the, again, very basic terms, it's any crime for gain that uses deception, or a criminal conduct that involves dishonest or deceitful means to use unjust advantage. Now, there are interesting models about why people commit fraud, more from psychology. I would say one of them is fraud triangle, saying that in order for fraud to be there, there should be three components: pressure, opportunity, and rationalization. So what that means is, for example, if I would decide to commit fraud, there must be some pressure. For example, John telling me to commit it, that could be coercion, or I need money, that's another pressure for any reason. Opportunity, so there must be some way for me to do that. Usually, based on research again, people who commit fraud work in a company for at least 5 years, so they know the procedures, they know how to override them, and they know where the loops and gaps are. And rationalization is personal justification of dishonest action, meaning that I should have something in my mind that's saying that I'm doing it because I'm entitled to it, I'm doing it because I'm getting underpaid, or I think something bad of my organization, that's why I want to deceive it, and so on. So that's a little bit of psychology here. This model is simply just money, ideology, coercion, ego, quite overlapping, but still interesting to bear in mind. Okay. So fraud tree, there is an association of fraud examiners, starts like ACCA, but then goes in a little bit different way. And they have an interesting classification of fraud. So they're saying that there are three main categories, which are corruption, asset misappropriation, and financial statements fraud. Now a question to you, what do you think is the most widespread of these three categories? All agree that corruption? Good, we got full house. And another question then, we'll have the answers, but still, what do you think of these three categories have the most impact on the organization, which hurts it toughest? corruption? Asset misappropriation? Good, good. So we have some statistics because the Association of Fraud Examiners issues annual reports based on the fraud examiners all around the world. And what they're saying is asset misappropriation is the most popular type of this fraud. Now, don't shout at me. I know they don't add up to 100, but that happens because you always types of fraud combined in each case. So asset misappropriation is very, very popular because I don't know, there are lots of reasons. There could be lots of reasons for it. Financial statements fraud is, although the least common, but it has the highest median loss of USD 800,000, as this study suggests. But it can actually ruin organization at all, like we had a case with Enron, for example, and many other cases.
Yeah, I think one thing to point out with this is as well, this is a global study, so it varies depending on the country. And if you looked at somewhere like Africa as a region, corruption is obviously way higher up than asset misappropriation, so it's a bit misleading just to look at it like that. And I think the other thing that's a little bit misleading, sorry Oleg, is that the actual costs to the company. So for something like corruption, for example, Oleg will talk about that in a bit more detail later on, but you might have the loss to the company of 250,000. But if they get caught by a regulator, the loss to the company is potentially 100 million or $1 billion, and we'll talk about those figures a bit later on. And also from a reputational perspective, share prices going down, all that kind of thing.
That's true. So you can actually that was a simplified version of fraud tree. You can look at the whole fraud tree on the website of ACCA. So there are some other interesting statistics I wanted to share with you. Yeah, it's just for you to note, and what John said, that it's a real worldwide study involving 125 countries and 23 industries. So where do you think the median loss is larger, for small business or for large? Any ideas for large?
For example, in Russia, it could be small and medium entity more affected by fraud because of weaknesses in internal control system of small and medium entity.
Actually, what you're saying is right for on worldwide basis, that loss to SMEs is almost 2 times higher. And I agree with you that usually large companies have better internal controls in place, and it's simpler to commit fraud in small companies, where people also tend to trust each other more. What do you think are top anti-fraud controls that can save your business? Sorry? Very topical in Russia. Let's see. Yeah. Any other thoughts?
Speaking, I would say that good corporate governance should be implemented in the corporation in order to prevent and detect fraud. Good corporate governance includes many types of controls, like segregation of duty authorization, two-tier board. It's a complex features which should be in place.
Yeah, but if you would pick from the things that are included there, what would you pick as the most? Authorization, like approval for payments. Good ERP. Okay. Actually, what the study suggests is data monitoring or analysis and surprise audits are top anti-fraud controls, but they are correlated with largest reduction in fraud loss and duration, but only 37% of victim organizations implemented these controls. So that's probably something for you to note. Data monitoring analysis can be difficult and sound very strange, But that's what different IT companies now doing, and that's also for you to think about. Any comments on that? No? You're right. So how is occupational fraud really detected if we turn on the Sherlock Holmes side of the story? How would you detect fraud?
First of all, we need to gather sufficient appropriate evidence of fraud. There are a lot of methods to do it. For example, we need to observe internal control system, interview with people, to analyze the data in order to find any differences.
Deficiencies. What do you think? Что по-русски позволит detect fraud?
Если молодой человек правильно говорит, он говорит про анализ данных на предмет аномалий или каких-то отклонений, которые никак не могли бы возникнуть в этой конкретной транзакции или в этом процессе.
So actually, whistleblower mechanism is the best way to detect fraud. That's what the study says. And actually, when we are asked to help, it's very common that a company says, we have a whistleblower allegation through our hotline, through anything. It could be from internal employee, it could be from external party. And that's because whistleblowers have some internal insider information about the fraud, which could lead, and otherwise you won't be able to identify it without this whistleblower involvement. So internal audit is also good, but on the second place, and what I wanted to point is that external audit is just here. So I trust and respect auditors, but it's not their primary aim to find fraud. And as I also worked in audit, I realized it becomes a problem of auditor when he or she finds some fraud or in financial statements, how to present it, how to deal with it, because if you ask auditors, they don't really want to provide you a bad opinion. They want also it to be good.
Yeah, I think another point to make on that one is that the people that are doing audits quite often within a Big Four firm, for example, are very junior. And the people that are committing fraud or corruption tend to be very senior. So it's quite difficult for somebody who's starting out in their career to go and challenge a CFO, a CEO, or an FD about their conduct.
So I think I now hand out to John. Yeah, go ahead.
Yeah, I agree. I think it depends on the country as well. So different countries have different concerns about whistleblowing. Some people will just not do it culturally, depending on the country. And actually, I think for a whistleblower, it's always quite...
I will take this question. You have mine. No. I will speak about whistleblowing as part of BI investigations later.
Yeah, okay, good.
I will talk about this.
Excellent.
Так тоже плохо. Okay, I think it appears.
Just a minute.
That's one, yeah. Окей, мы тогда будем просто. We'll just make a sign to our IT assistant there to move next. Yeah. Okay. Go ahead.
Excellent. So these are the key investigative tools. Do you want me just to talk without the slide? Okay, so as forensic accountants, there are a variety of different things that we would use as part of the investigations that we do. I can't show you any of them, unfortunately, but please believe me that they do exist. So in terms of an issue that comes to our attention, usually from my perspective, we will work with companies that are based either headquartered in the UK or in the US or in Europe who have a presence in other countries. So quite often subsidiaries in Africa or the Middle East or Russia. So I'm here quite often working with people like Oleg and some of my colleagues that are here. When an issue comes up, it's usually through a whistleblower, and it may not be that it's a whistleblower that's actually contacted somebody within the company. They might have tried to do that and then they've had no response, or they might be too scared to do it. Increasingly what we're seeing is that whistleblowers will they'll make their concerns public by going to a newspaper or television or some other route. But when the allegation comes through, it's typically sent to us by the client and they'll ask us to help them to investigate. The first part of what we will do is to look at the allegation itself. So it might be that there are people that are named in it, it might be there are suppliers that are named in it, customers, and we'll do some intelligence work around that. Part of that could be information that's in the public domain, so you're looking at media, or you're looking at Spark, or you're looking at other websites like that. Nabi over there is my colleague who is nodding and saying he's going to cover this, so I won't talk about that in too much detail. But that's usually the first part of what we would be to do some intelligence to try and understand whether we can identify any evidence or any kind of concerns that this might actually be a real problem for the company. The second part of what we would do would be to collect data, so collect electronic data from the company. And if we're doing that, I'll come onto that in a second and show you in more detail. Normally it's collecting things like accounting systems, electronic data, it could be laptops, desktops, it could be phones, that kind of thing. The next stage of it, I'll come on to in a second, and thankfully this slide is working. So in relation to collecting data, the first thing that you need to do is really to understand where that data actually sits. You can make a lot of mistakes at this stage when you're collecting that data. You could go on site and the people that you're looking to take information from aren't there. You might go on site and you think that the accounting system sits in a particular location and actually it sits somewhere else. And by the time you've gone there and you've done that, you look a bit stupid. The people will be tipped off about what it is that you know. So a bit of preparation before you go on site is very important to understand where the data sits, also to understand which people's data you actually want to collect. Are they there? Are they on holiday? And I know that sounds very basic and very stupid, but quite often in investigations people make mistakes around the collection of data that can really cause a problem further on down the line. People may have more than one device. So when I first started doing investigations years ago, people had a laptop, maybe. Normally it was a desktop. Now it's laptop, desktop, phone, tablets. And you need to collect all of that information because people communicate in different ways. In terms of the actual collection of information itself, we have what we call an IT forensics team. And Oleg talked before about forensic being in relation to court. We always work on the basis that anything that we do could end up in court. So any collection of information we do needs to be forensically sound, we would say. So it's in a state where if you were to go to the police or if it was to end up in court, they would be comfortable that it was fully evidenced. The other thing to mention is not to forget paper. These days it's very, very key to collect electronic information and people concentrate on that. But there could be information like contracts, invoices and supplier information that you'd also be using. Okay, so the data sources, I started to talk about this before, and again, when I first started doing investigations 15, 16 years ago, it was just PCs and laptops. That has changed. Information sits in different places now. Many of the global corporations, their data actually may not sit in Russia, it may sit somewhere else. So if you have a US company, they may back up all their accounting systems, their emails, it may all sit in the US or it may sit somewhere else. USB sticks can contain data, mobile devices, other devices I talked about already, and paper documents as well. Structured data is the kind of things that you'd be dealing with on a day-to-day basis. So it's ERP systems, spreadsheets, and accounting databases. We'll talk about how we analyze that information, but it's very key in any investigation that we do. Semi-structured data and unstructured data is more around things like email, WhatsApp, chats, Skype Messenger, that kind of thing. All of that information can be relevant for the investigation. I would say probably 5 or 6 years ago, if you were doing an investigation, the key source of information and evidence would be email. These days, probably nobody communicates on email if they're communicating anything that's particularly suspicious, because everybody knows that email can be collected, it can be reviewed. So people have moved on to various different devices. So WhatsApp is something that people use all the time. And I'll come on to some problems that there are with that. Okay, so the kind of challenges that we would experience when we're actually collecting information in an investigation itself. So encryption on devices. If you think of something like an iPhone, you have passwords on it, WhatsApp is encrypted, and it means that even though you can go and you can try and collect that information by kind of plugging a device in to take the information off of it, you actually can't access it because you can't access it without the password and you can't access the information that's on there. Increasingly, people are more and more aware that you can delete information from devices. Again, going back maybe 5 years, if we collected a laptop or we collected a phone and somebody had deleted information from it, it was almost certain that you'd be able to recover it because the information would still sit there. You just wouldn't actually be able to see it if you were going onto the device. These days, there are what they call anti-forensics tools that are very, very easy to get. So if anybody in the room wants to commit a fraud or be corrupt, and you want to cover your traces, then you can definitely do that. Basically, if you Google anti-forensic tools, you'll find some. You can probably download it for free. And then once you've deleted anything from your laptop, it overwrites it and it's gone forever. Changing software and operating systems. So IT forensics people, the tools and the techniques that they use are always kept up to date. But if you think of something like Apple, where they're issuing changes in the operating system and you click and you accept it and it updates your device, it means you need to change the way that you can acquire that information forensically. So every time there's an update, the people that are in my IT forensics team need to sit there and work out a way around that, so it means that they can still collect and access that information. Data protection and employee rights. I think I won't talk too much about Russia because it's definitely more difficult to get access to employee information in Russia than in a lot of countries. And cross-border data movement is another one. Also, it can be a problem in Russia if you're trying to do the investigation somewhere else, because actually physically taking people's data, their emails, their personal information off-site can be a real problem. The other thing is something like personal data. So people have they use their devices for taking pictures, they use devices for communicating with people, for maybe making banking transactions, and all that personal information is something that, again, in Russia is very, very difficult to justify looking at. Interviews. So once we've collected information, the typical second stage of this would be interviews. Interviews are very important as part of the investigation that you do because it's your first chance to sit with people and test some of the theories that you've got. And it may be that your interviews are driven by just talking through the allegations that you've got and sense-checking them with people, questioning them and trying to get information from them. Or it could be, if you've had the chance to actually review the data that you've collected, that there are emails, there's documents that you can present to them, copies of invoices, copies of contracts, things that don't look right, that you can present to them as part of the interview. It's very important to work out whether you want to record that interview. Again, it depends on the country as to whether you're allowed to do that. But if you can actually take a record of the interview, if you can tape the interview, you can use that information as part of any kind of prosecution, or if you want to get rid of an employee, then you could use that as well. As a rule for us, the interviews that we do, you would typically have 2 people there. We've put here leading interviewer and note taker, and I don't think that's really quite a fair way of describing it. 2 interviewers, you need 2 interviewers because when you're asking questions, you may have a very good plan at the start, but you need to actually be listening to what the person is saying rather than just going straight through your plan. Because if you go through your plan, someone's talking to you, you're concentrating on asking them the next question, you can miss some of the information that they're saying. And that's why it's very important to have a second person there. because that second person is probably listening in a slightly different way to the way that you are. So when you've finished asking your first question, your second question, your third question, they may come in and they may clarify one of the points that you've got, or they might have some thoughts that are clever compared to the ones that you're thinking about.
And let me jump in here to say that if you're doing an internal investigation, you should be prepared for these interviews to as much as possible. So you must do all analysis before that. You must have all the documents in front of people, so when they're trying to give you generic answers that could mean anything, you can point out the document and say, look here, what's this, how it comes here. So there is sometimes a intention to, when someone knows that from whistleblower or from anyhow that fraud is potentially happening in the organization, to run to interviews and say, well, come here to my room, let's discuss it, but that's not what you should do. You should first analyze data and then conduct interviews.
Yeah, it's gone. And just one other point to make in relation to interviews is that the style of interview that you have can be very different. So if you're talking to somebody that you think is a witness or may have some information that can support you, then the way that you actually ask them the questions, the way that you challenge them, and the sort of pressure that you put on them is going to be very different to somebody that you suspect is involved in a fraud or in corruption. And actually, there are all kinds of different ways that you can interview. There's lots of different tactics for doing it. Personally, I try to be as gentle as possible with people for as long as possible within the interview and try and build trust with them. And actually, if you're having a conversation with somebody, it becomes kind of quite natural. And then if you ask them a question about a subject that's a lot more difficult, it actually can catch them a bit off guard. So they're not expecting the question. They're not expecting you to change from being soft into being hard. And that can then cause a problem for them. In terms of the next steps from there, so email review, electronic review, if you just bear with me, most of these pictures relate to email, but if you think of this electronic review as being of all electronic material, so emails, chat logs, WhatsApps, that kind of thing, there is an enormous amount of data out there now. So years ago you would have people communicating in email. It might be an internal email system and people would send a few emails a day. These days you have so many different devices, people use them in a completely different way. They communicate on WhatsApp, you can send 100, 200 WhatsApp messages a day. So there's an enormous amount of data out there and there's an enormous amount of information that you need to review as part of an email review or electronic review. And to give you an example of that, it's not uncommon for us to collect information from somebody that's at a senior level within a business and they might have 1 million documents. So where do you start if you have 1 million documents? It's very, very difficult. And if you then have 5, 6, 7 people's data that you need to look at, it could be 2, 3, 4, 5 million documents. It's incredibly difficult to work out where to start. I think it's very important that you use the right tools to do that. There are a variety of different email review systems that you can use or electronic data review systems that you can use. And this is becoming a lot more technical now. So a lot more sophisticated, I should say, than it used to be. So there's artificial intelligence and machine learning that can be played over the electronic communications to pick up patterns within them and to try and reduce down the volume of information you need to look at. At the bottom here we've said minimize the data set, investigate what's left, organize and prioritize and accelerate the review. I think in an investigation it's important to make progress very, very quickly because from a client perspective, for example, it's quite expensive to have somebody doing an investigation for them. I probably shouldn't say that as somebody that does investigations, but it's true. So the quicker that you can make progress and the quicker you can find important information, the better, really. I've put some various different terms up there. I think, but without going into them all in detail, effectively there are lots of different tools that can help you to reduce the email population. So for example, if I send an email to Oleg and I copy in 3 or 4 other people, because we have copies of all of those individual emails, that might be 8 or 10 emails just in relation to one email. So you have to find a way to actually reduce that down. And there are software available that can do that. It can remove anything that looks like a duplicate. It can remove any document that looks almost the same or nearly the same as another one. Technology-assisted review is another thing. So This is very, very prevalent now in bigger investigations. So anything that's a big regulatory investigation, it's likely that they'll use technology-assisted review or machine learning. And what we mean by that is that the software for prioritizing the documents that you need to review learns from the people that are making the decisions. So if you think of an example where you may have 1 million documents and you need to do a review, as an investigator, you might have some ideas of the people's information that you want to look at, the date range of the information that you want to look at. You may have some keywords, so the name of a supplier or the name of an individual, and you effectively can search that information almost as if it's a Google search. So you type in the names, you run a search, and it will bring up every single document that responds to that particular search term. That doesn't really help you if you have lots and lots of emails. So if you have 1 million emails and the name of a supplier, that name of a supplier might appear in an Excel spreadsheet because it gets circulated every week, and you could have 100, 200, 300 copies of that Excel sheet. So you end up with lots and lots of documents to review. The technology-assisted review, effectively you have 2 or 3 of your most senior investigators that will work on the investigation that will do the email review. Prior to technology-assisted review being involved, it would actually be the most junior people in your team normally that would do email review because they were the cheapest. It was the best way for the client because they were running through lots and lots of documents, reviewing them and trying to make decisions about whether they were relevant. So it made sense to have the more junior people doing it. But now, because we have so much data and there's so many emails, there's so many communications, we have to think about it in a slightly smarter way. So these days, it's usually the most senior person that will start doing the review. They'll run some searches, they'll think about what they think might be the issues, and they'll start to look at documents, and they will mark those documents as either being relevant, not relevant, or highly relevant to the case. The algorithm within the software actually learns from that. So it will look for documents that have similar properties. So not necessarily similar wording within it, but similar concepts. And every time you make a decision and you mark a document as highly relevant, it will then look for documents that are very, very similar to that, and it will move them up towards the top of your review queue. So when you're reviewing the next set of documents, you make a decision on the next set of documents. Each time the machine is learning from that, and it's pushing up the documents to you that it thinks are most relevant to your work. And it means that very, very quickly you're seeing things, theoretically, that should be the most important to you in your case. It's you, I think.
Okay. So to pick up on that, we use different types of analysis here. Actually, whatever comes, accounts payable information, CRM information, email, as John said, but human, I would like to highlight that humans are the most valuable piece of information so far based on my experience in investigations, because what we get from people during the interviews, it's something we don't really know and find when we are looking just on CRM or accounting systems. But when we get the data, we can apply different techniques to analyze it. So, for example, here you can see that payments can be broken down by both time they were made and the weekday. And if something happens on Sunday or Saturday, there could be some justification for that. For example, a business is part of the business is running in Asia or in US, or there is some automatic entry that can be done, but you should investigate. It's just a lead, and you need to get into it. The same works for the hours, night hours when transactions are made. Also, we break down, for example, amounts by payment, number of payments, look for vendors that are outliers here. Again, can be just your main vendor, trusted, vetted, and reliable, but that can bring you some sort of idea where to dig deeper. That's another example, an interesting one. It highlights amounts spent by employees for their expense reports, and that's the amount they spent while it were cash-based, and then credit cards were introduced, so it became more transparent what type of costs you incur during your advance reports, and just by doing that, the amount spent by employees dropped, so employees became spending less, meaning there could have been something during these months and years. So expenses can also be tracked by region, by individuals, by cities they incurred, and so on and so forth. So whatever data can give you, you should look at it and look even deeper, try to see new angles.
Yeah.
But also,
so for data analytics that we're talking about there, this is probably the most accounting part of the investigation that we would do, and this is taking literally everything out of your ERP system, dumping it into some software, and then running tests across it. A part of those tests would be things that are typical standard things that you would look for if you're looking for a fraud. So it might be duplicate payments to a supplier, or it could be large round sum transactions that are being made to a supplier. So the kind of things that as a person that's naturally cynical, you might think looks a bit strange. So you can run automatic tests that will look across every single accounting transaction that there's been to look for those type of things. Or if you're thinking about the things that have come out of your email review and you've identified maybe a particular supplier, you can start to look at the patterns of payments and the patterns of transactions in relation to that particular supplier. And the idea is that it doesn't solve the case for you, but what it does is it means that it pushes up certain transactions that look like red flags. So you can spend your time looking at those individual transactions rather than looking at all of the data that you've got. Oleg was talking before about audit and the fact that auditors, the work that they do is not really intended to identify fraud. And that's because it's kind of like a sample basis, isn't it? You do a sample test of transactions and you hope that you find evidence that those transactions happened rather than evidence that they didn't. Whereas for data analytics, the kind of power of it really is that it's looking at every single transaction, and the things that we could have spent many, many months doing, it will be done automatically, and it will be put into a format like Oleg showed before, where it's in graphical, it's pictorial. You can look at it and you can see those patterns without having to kind of spend all your time going down an Excel spreadsheet. This one in particular, if any of these things that you see here, so anything that's on this particular dashboard, you can click on and it will expand into something else. So for example, if you clicked on the big circle there for Meredith, Meredith is one of the employees in this particular case. She was the worst of the employees. You would not be overly surprised. But if you click on Meredith, it then brings up every single cash and credit amount by month for her. It shows exactly which individual location she made expense claims in relation to, and you just break it down. So anybody could sit there at any level within the organisation and have access to these dashboards and sit and click through and try and test their own theories for it. So that's probably why it's more powerful than just doing a manual paper review. Sorry.
That's all right. Okay. Now what we also like to highlight that apart from the accounting systems, we also look at Spark, of course, social media, internet, to see the connections that we can identify between our subjects, between the target, and to identify whoever is connected to whom. And I'm sure that Nabi will talk more about that, but I just wanted to highlight that we use that a lot and produce the diagrams for our investigations. So this covers roughly what we wanted to talk you through on the tools and for investigations. Now I would like to move on to case studies. And one thing to highlight here is Foreign Corrupt Practices Act. It's a US law, anti-corruption law, that prohibits basically bribery of government officials in jurisdictions both outside and inside of US. It has quite, as you can see, the penalties can be high, and it can be also subject to imprisonment up to 5 years for individual violations. There is a table here that shows companies, countries, and the top settlements. As you can see, the amounts are in $1 million and even in $1 billion. Mostly, it's not connected to United States. The top cases, as you can see, just Halliburton, US-based company, and there was a recent case in March 2019 of settlement with a Russian telecom company as well. Actually, when talking about corruption, seems like a very distant topic, but there's an example I can ask you about. So, for example, you are a young investment professional on trip, having lunch with some foreign government officials, then people go out and you're left with just one other government official who slides the bill to you and says, is there any problem? So what would you do in that situation? Any smart solutions? What would you do?
It's a trick question.
Yes, it is. That's why we ask.
There's a saying in Russian that рука руку моет, а обе руки моют лицо. But I would not take the deal. Definitely.
So say no. That's a very good thing to do, actually. Charity. So you're saying, I'm not paying for the bill, but let's pay for charity. Facilitation payments. Commission. Facilitation payments are interesting ones. I think they're allowed under some of the international anti-bribery laws, but under other they are prohibited. So you better be very careful with that. So yes, the best course of action is politely say no and say that you require compliance approval. But let's get realistic. It's very hardly difficult for me to believe that could be the case unless you're really tough. The thing is that you can pay the bill, but then you should talk to compliance and to document this case. And if there is no corrupt intent in this, that shouldn't be a corruption case under FCCA. But the worst thing to do is to pay the bill and do nothing, because that can raise questions if this ever happens and someone opens your cash book, cash receipts and sees.
Just in relation to the FCCA,
Yeah,
I think the relevance of it is that although it's a US piece of legislation, and I'm probably telling people in the room stuff they know already, although it's a US piece of legislation, it's the most prosecuted in the world. And the US authorities will go after any major company that's got a presence anywhere in the world if they think that they can prosecute them and they think they can get a fine from them. So you don't need to be based in the US. All they need to do is to find some angle that connects it to the US, and it could be that the payment has been made in dollars. It could be that even as simple as there's an email server in the US, and the email in relation to the transaction has gone through the US, and they can use that, and then they can go after companies. And if you're a multinational company like some of the ones that were on that list, the reality of it is you either cooperate with them and you pay a fine, or you never ever operate in the US, you never have a dollar account, so people just do. So that massive list of fines that were there before, it's quite an incentive for people to try and cooperate with them, not because they're going to pay the fine, but if they don't pay the fine, they're never going to be able to operate in the US. And just the other point to make around whistleblowers, the piece of legislation that supports the FCCA, as Oleg said, it's 10 to 30% of the fine that a whistleblower will get. So if you think of somebody within a company and they're looking at their firm potentially being fined $1 billion, it's quite attractive to them that they might get 100 million if they report it through. And that's what the US authorities will do. So anybody that is a whistleblower and goes directly to the authorities, and that's the kind of the key point, they have to go to the DOJ or the SEC. If they do that, they're entitled to between 10 and 30% of the settlement, which is a lot.
So I skipped one case study because I think we're running out of time, but I think you can get the slides and see it by yourself. I'm gonna talk you through another case study that I was involved in. So we had a client which was an automotive equipment producer. And there were, again, two separate whistleblower reports there. As I mentioned, that's quite popular thing to start with. And allegedly the director of the plant and its senior manager had a network of suppliers they owned. And the tenders were rigged in his favor, and there was an allegation that he receives kickbacks from these suppliers. And it was a difficult task because he was the very ruler, the very high management of this plant and for the whole region. And it should be that's why an external consultant was engaged by the international management of that company in order to do an independent review and be authoritative enough to challenge this guy. So what we did, we conducted detailed interviews with the whistleblowers that took place in neighboring countries in order for confidentiality to remain, because there were these, as one of you flagged, that whistleblowers were afraid that there will be sanctions against them, so that's why the interviews were conducted out of that jurisdiction. And that interviews followed up by very tough due diligence procedures and all the suppliers in order to understand what we're dealing with, when they were registered, how or is there any connection to this head of this plant, and on paper at least it occurred that there was no apparent connection. They were not anyhow. We investigated then accounting records, focusing on payments, what payments were done for these suppliers, in what months, again, doing some dashboards as you saw. And we conducted interviews with local staff to understand the decision-making process behind the suppliers, being very gentle, just that's a process-based interview, no allegations, just explain me how it works in your company, that kind of approach. Findings. What was the result of that investigation is that the head of plant, described by the whistleblowers as the mastermind of the fraud, was dismissed by the client after our preliminary investigation, and he was very keen to step back, actually. Probably he understood that something is going on, that he got caught. But apart from that, we revealed control and compliance issues that confirmed whistleblower allegations there. Part of them were confirmed, by the way, and part of them were not, because there were a lot of allegations being done, because whistleblowers are actually interesting people, I would say. We very often see that whistleblowers can have their own motives, their own reasons why they are telling what they're telling. And there can be just some people, some individual in the company wants to get rid of his boss. He writes a whistleblower report in order to do that. That can be the case when we saw that during some of the investigations. So when we looked at the data, we see that the vendors had a lot of red flags, for example, incorporated shortly before the payments, registered in a residential apartment, main registered activity not corresponding to what they were services they rendered to the client. And we reviewed also the tender documents they provided. We saw some strange names that potentially submitted their bids. And we, through subcontractors, we contacted former employees of these entities to ask, did you really work for that client? And they said no. There were a lot of irregularities based on this kind of research and investigation that also confirmed that some of the allegations were true. So I think this covers our part, and I can now hand over to Nabi to talk more about business intelligence and due diligence.
Thank you. My name is Nabi Abdullayev, and I'm the head of business intelligence and political analysis in the Moscow office covering Russia and the former Soviet Union. And I will talk about the investigation cycle. So, as we already agreed here, usually it starts with some kind of alert that the company gets. It can be a whistleblower report. And returning to your question, usually most companies now, they use special other companies that get the reports, that the line does not go, that does not end inside the company. It goes to another special law company, sometimes even located in a different country. And then upon agreement with the kind of home company, they distribute the information from the report to the board and not to the people, to immediate bosses of a person. So there is a certain kind of check in the system. Another system is that people can send their whistleblower reports anonymously. They can set up Gmails, Proton mails, or call from burner phones once, just say something and just hang up and delete the email address. It still will be considered as a legitimate kind of trigger to start an investigation. Mostly it's whistleblowers. In my practice, I'm with Control Risk for 3 years, and I'm dealing with whistleblowers all the times. And this case that Oleg just described, I was one of the consultants who interviewed these whistleblowers. In half of the cases, the information provided to whistleblowers is not real. In another half, it's usually has some legitimacy and leads to real serious investigations. Another way when the company gets alerted is usually when there is a change of manager. Someone comes in and starts like checking papers, looking into the history, what kind of company, what kind of unit I got, and he sees something is going fishy. That people do not answer questions, they cannot produce documents, they are kind of evading questions, and then this manager understands, I need to investigate. There are two ways. He can go to police, he can go to law enforcement, but you know, in the context of in the corporate context, like bringing in law enforcers on this stage is kind of a very rough and very strong move. That's why they turn to companies like ours. So it can be a manager. So the next stage, imagine control risks is being brought and we start consultations with the people. Usually we talk to the heads of the units or the heads of the corporations or chief legal officers, sometimes security officers, heads of security. And so we plan the investigation. There are two major avenues to go on. One is that Oleg and John described. It's a fraud and forensic investigation. Another one is due diligence or business intelligence investigation. Sometimes the company decides to pursue two avenues immediately because they got enough information from whistleblower or from the manager. They know who the person, who is the suspect, who is the subject of investigation, and what kind of wrongdoings he made, and where to look for the evidence. But more often, the first stage is to get some intelligence before you start. This produces intelligence, knowledge that you know, but this is not kind of an evidence that you can bring to court. With fraud and forensic, it's more of evidence. So in order to kind of narrow down your search, initially, very often, company decide to do business intelligence first, and then, based on the findings, to go on with the forensic investigation. So the investigation starts. Imagine we are having a case with a fraud. Usually fraud takes place in sales, procurement, marketing, and it's very interesting when we were doing Kazakhstan cases. In Kazakhstan, a lot of fraud or kind of corruption happens in HR. Yeah, certain people in HR sell jobs to candidates. They take money to take people on the job. So when people get the money from some kind of fraud activities, what do they do with them? Well, they spend. So how we can understand that a person spends more than he makes? Yeah, we are looking at his lifestyle. Absolutely, absolutely, lifestyle. So if a person suddenly, after getting a managerial position or a position in which he has a right to, over some budget, like for procurement or for sales or for marketing, and if this person suddenly, well, after a while, buys an expensive car, expensive apartment, starts going to Maldives, or his wife starts, or husband starts sporting expensive watches, or luxury shoes, or Brionis, or their children start driving like Porsche cars, like Ferraris and Mercedeses. Yeah, this is a red flag. This is not an evidence of a wrongdoing. It's because he can say, my babushka died, yeah, and she left me some heritage, and that's how I use it. But this is something to start looking at. How we can get this evidence about lifestyle? Of course, you said social networks. Also, we can observe this person, whether there are expensive clothes, expensive watches, nice car on the parking lot. Can we check the property that person buys? If he bought a dacha or a cottage in Barvicha or something like this, it is possible to check if you are not a FSB general. Yeah, everything that people buy, like property, it gets registered, and this register is public knowledge. You can always kind of find what belongs to whom. So this is a lifestyle thing. Once we kind of have some indication of people who are sporting or showing a lifestyle that is above their means, we need to start thinking how they make money. So we start looking for some ways, say, of how they made it. Usually it's done through kickbacks or through conflict of interest. I mean, the money are being sent to companies that are related. And here comes Spark. So Spark is a tool where you can check owners, you can check managers, and using also social networks, find connections between, he sells it to his brother, he sells it to his wife, his son. Very often people sell to their mistresses and lovers or girlfriends and boyfriends. Or they give discounts, strong discounts on, especially in the construction industry. For some elements, the discounts may reach 75–80%. Yeah, and top managers can give these big discounts, and we investigated a case in which a top manager of a Russian branch of a big American company was selling to his girlfriend some construction materials with a discount of 70%. And when the buyers were calling him, he instructed all salespeople to go and buy from Marina. She will give you 15% discount from our price. So the difference was split between them. So we start looking for ways, we start looking for companies, we start looking for traces, the organizational traces. Organizational links. What else can motivate a person to get into some kind of corrupt dealing. We need to look at the situation not mechanically, like follow the money. We need to understand also circumstances when a person, which push a person into corruption. If a person is under very heavy debt, is it something that can like trigger opportunism? Yeah, can we check whether the person is indebted? Yes, we can. Well, to a certain extent. For example, if a person defaulted on a bank loan, he is already in the Федеральная служба приставов database, which is open. You can just go on their website, and there are companies and individuals who are in their databases. So we can check this. People are not coming to the company and committing a single financial wrongdoing, a crime, or single commercial, like corrupt act. I will take this one kickback and I will never do it again. They come with history, or the history starts in most cases, and this is a repetitive thing. Can we check whether this guy has a history of corruption in his past? Well, we can look in the court databases. We can look through litigation history. Can we imagine whether a person, whether a contributing factor would be that someone feels emboldened to go into corruption if he is well connected, if his father is a prosecutor, or his brother is a judge, or a police colonel? Definitely, it's a factor that we need to take into account. And if we have like a number of suspect people, I think it is worth to run their connection, their close connections. We usually call it, we try like to run people and companies through criminal links and political links. And political links include links to high-profile security officials. So whether there are political links and criminal links. So after conducting, some of this stuff can be found in the public record, but most of it cannot. Like lifestyle, yes, I agree. People sport lifestyle, they show it. Ways, organization links, sometimes it is possible to find traces that his brother, his mother, his son. But what if second names do not coincide? How do we know whether there is any connection? These guys can be school friends or university friends, or as I said, girlfriend or boyfriends. There is no public record about them being boyfriend or girlfriend unless they have pictures of contactee together somewhere on a yacht. Yeah. So this is initially we do public record, and then we do source inquiries. We ask the same questions to our sources. Who are our sources? Control Risks in Russia set up an office in Russia in 1994. And over these 25 years, we developed sources, we developed contacts in every region, in every sector, in every republic of the former Soviet Union, not only in Russia. Before coming to the Moscow Times, to Control Risks, I was a journalist for 20 years. My last job was I was the chief editor of the Moscow Times, the newspaper. I have 1,100 contacts on my Facebook. 400 of them are journalists from all over the world. So when I need something, I can reach out into this vast network and find people who know nearly everyone. Not necessarily this particular journalist, but they can find other contacts. And people, I run a team of 10 people. There are other journalists there, and people who worked before me, they created a huge database of contacts and subcontractors all over the former Soviet Union that counts hundreds and hundreds of contacts and people whom we can reach out, ask questions, and they will talk to us. So these people will tell us about the links between the companies. They will tell us about whether this person is in debt, whether he is connected to certain political or Siloviki people, or whether he has certain criminal links, and most of all, whether there are problems with the reputation. Because if a person starts demanding kickbacks or gives bribes or goes into certain dealings, he's not doing it with a single person. People replicate their criminal behavior. If it works once, they try to make it again. If it works twice, they continue. And eventually, the market knowledge appears. So people in the market, people in the same sector, know that this guy, Ivan or Sergey, is kind of the guy who takes kickback or demands kickbacks. Yeah, or he's very easy in kind of giving discounts. If you like give half of this discount, bring it back. So there is a market knowledge in which we can tap and get information from there. These are part of the investigations. They are costly, and usually we start doing it when already a lot of damage is done. And usually this Ivan is not alone, because there are Sergey, Masha, Petya, and there is like a number of people with whom the company needs to deal with. So it's much more cheaper and cleaner way is to just to check these guys before they're accepted on the managerial positions. Or if we talk about the company, it's better to check them before, like conduct all these checks before you onboard them, before you like sign a partner agreement that they will be providing something for you or something that you be selling it. So if you do this exercise before, it's called due diligence. That's actually it. Well, due diligence, you also have to add sanctions compliance. So to check whether this person or the company are under the American sanctions or European sanctions or in international or national blacklists. Thank you. And I'm ready to answer your questions. Please.
What are the most frequent difficulties do you face during due diligence and forensic engagement?
What are the largest differences?
Yes. The most frequent difficulties.
I will ask. Well, I will tell about business intelligence investigations, and my colleagues will say about forensic investigations. The largest difficulty is to find public record and sources in some jurisdictions that are non-transparent. For example, in Azerbaijan and Turkmenia, and we are having cases in Turkmenia. There are companies who are doing business there, they have offices there, and then suddenly they receive a whistleblower call who's saying there is a lot of like something fishy is going on, please can you investigate? Yeah, in Russia, despite whatever is being said, public record, corporate record are really rich and good. There is a lot of stuff there. But there are jurisdictions like Belarus is non-transparent, Uzbekistan, Turkmenistan, and Azerbaijan that are really difficult. In other countries, it's easy. So in this case, we rely more on sources rather than on documented stuff that is available in the public record.
When my take on forensic side of it would be that it's difficult to obtain the right data that you need, and there can be two aspects about that. First of all, some of the companies do not have good accounting databases, and if you get garbage data in, you get garbage data out. Another thing what John was talking about is that nowadays a lot of people do not use their corporate emails to commit fraud, of course. So you need to look for other means of transfer information, and usually, well, when we come to a company and we are asked by international senior management to collect laptops from the regional management, we need them to sign consent form that they agree to provide their laptop, which they can disagree and say, no, we won't. So that would be a very big problem. And there is no, I would say, no simple way to get to person's personal mobile phone, which usually has all the evidence that we need for investigation. But there can be indirect ways. For example, we had a case when we were able to collect a laptop, and on that laptop there was a backup of iPhone. Just a person plugged in iPhone, pushed some button, never really reading what was that, and that was a message: do you want to do a backup of your phone on your laptop, on your corporate laptop? And so that was the case when we restored the phone itself. We were able on our computers to look through the data they had there, their Viber, their messages, iMessage, WhatsApp, whatsoever, and very good evidence was found there for interviews. I don't know what.
I would say exactly the same as Oleg in relation to actually getting access to information is the most difficult thing that we would face. In kind of contrast to that, the place where you find most information, even if you can't get access to emails and WhatsApp and all that kind of thing, is actually in the accounting records. Because if there's a fraud or if there's a corruption payment, like, it's had to go through the accounting. So that's probably the place where there is evidence, even if you can't find communications. So it's just trying to work out where you can find those transactions and where you can see those strange movements of money. That's where the data analytics comes in.
And any other questions you have? Just a minute.
May I ask maybe 2 questions, if you don't mind? Thank you very much for a very interesting presentation. Actually, fraud investigation is a really hard topic, and in my opinion, I can see that it's quite a dangerous job as well. So I just wanted to get your opinion. How do you deal with this, fear sort of thing of fraud investigation? Because let's take a case. I just spoke to one lady actually, and she told me that once she was appointed as sort of fraud investigator, and by the owner, but the person who was actually under sort of not investigation but was suspected was a top manager of the company, and was private, like not a big company but private, sort of middle-sized company. And she said that she didn't feel really very comfortable with the situation, because on the one hand she knew that the fraud took place and she knew that the person was responsible for that, but she was afraid that some kind of wrongdoing might happen to her. How would you deal in this situation if it was some of you who was actually in that case, that you knew that there was wrongdoing and you had some proofs of that, but at the same time you knew that you might get into trouble because that person was quite powerful and could, bring you trouble?
I wouldn't go. Only joking. No, so I think on every case that we would do some form of risk assessment about security risk. And the part of the work that Nabi would do around the intelligence and trying to understand if people are politically connected or if there's concerns about them being violent, you can find out as part of the intelligence before you would do the work. Other things that you can potentially do is actually access information remotely. So instead of going and collecting and interviewing people and going and collecting electronic data on site, you could maybe get it off site. So if the information is backed up somewhere else, you go and collect that, you do your review there, so people don't see that you're there. But it is difficult, and it depends on the country. We're doing quite a lot of work in Africa at the moment, and we have security with us the whole time.
When we come to talk to a person, it means that the machine, the mechanism is already rolling. Even if we step back, I mean, the company has to do something. They will bring another guy. Yeah. And I mean, there is nothing personal in our engagement. We are kind of mechanical, well, like yeah, I want to say, I want to find a good, a good comparison. I mean, it's like, we are investigators and we are being called to investigate the case by the company top management. And if, for example, a person here, a local manager, manages to scare us and we just stop investigation, this does not mean that the investigation will be stopped. Yeah, the people on the top, they will bring other people, or they will just find ways to bring us back into the investigation. And also, I don't think that, you should understand the strategic calculus of a person who is being investigated. Is he interested in kind of aggravating his situation by threatening us? I don't think so. So these people are like quite strategic, and when they see us, when they see that they are already being interviewed, that their laptops and phone numbers, telephones are kind of being, that we collect information from them, it doesn't make sense to threaten us somehow already. Yeah, it's too late already. Yeah, thank you.
Well, to add up on that, when I worked at Big Four, I had 2 packs of business cards. One was saying fraud investigation, another was saying just audit services. And I would say I would mostly use the audit services business cards when I arrived at targets or clients. And yes, if there is a way to soften what you do, you should use that chance, saying that it's an audit, it's a compliance review, it's a consulting project, it's not fraud investigation by any means. And that's one of the ways to get around it. Yeah, you had another question.
Yeah, I might have another one, but I'm just thinking whether I want to take a chance to ask the third question if no one is asking. The second one would be about interviews. Are you taking some particular special studies how to interview people? Because I know it's like, do you remember the movie, The Liar, something, and how you have to watch the person, how the person behaves. Yeah, the body language. Yeah, you have to study the body. So do you go through such sort of education process that you study how to see the behavior of the person answering your question? I don't know how to put it in other words, because it's quite difficult, as I understand. If you scratch the ear, let's say, or the nose or something, it's just like primitive way to put it, but sometimes people react occasionally not even knowing that if they're lying, so then you can sort of screen their body language.
Well, I received a couple of trainings on that one. I would say first thing is to structure your interviews. If we put body language aside for a while, the best usually thing to do is to start with general questions. Tell me who you are, how long you've been with the company, what are your responsibilities, and talk with a person in order to gain some relaxation from him, so he's not fearing. And then, then you start to ask general questions about the business processes, and he gives you or she gives you general answers. But then you narrow down and you start to ask detailed questions. So there is no possible way for him to produce generic answers to that questions because you had answered them before. So that's kind of filtering and narrowing down interviewing technique you can use, setting body language aside. You can also think of body language, but I would be very cautious about that because there are some psychological studies, but that's not really 100% guarantee that if you see someone scratching in the ear, that means he is lying. People sometimes just use that kind of pose as their simple pose and their basic one. So you can say he's being secretive or closing, but some people just that's the way it is. It's also very when you're looking at body language, what I believe in at least, you can see how a person behaves when he's relaxed, and then when you start tough questions, you can see if something changes in his posture, in something in the way he talks. There are probably gaps in his speech, or he mumbles. That you can compare a relaxed state to the tense state and do some findings, observations on that. I don't know, Nabi, if you want to.
Well, I didn't do many interviews in my life, I mean investigative interviews, but we have colleagues in the Moscow office who have background in working for law enforcement, and they have special training. They have been trained on how to conduct investigative interviews. Myself, I was a journalist for many years, and I conducted interviews, including with people like Shamil Basayev and Khattab, if you remember these guys, yeah, these terrible Chechen warlords. Yeah, and I have a degree from Harvard University in negotiations and conflict resolution, and plus my experience in interviewing difficult people. Yeah, this is something that is helpful. Yeah, thank you.
And one question.
Regarding the evidence that you collected from copies of the personal phone or other devices, is it considered as official evidence for some court cases or for the police? Because, for instance, you can present it to the person who is suspected in a fraud, but he would answer that you made it yourself, I do not accept your allegations, etc. So what you do with such sort of evidence?
There are a lot of aspects about answering this question, actually. I would start that it really depends on jurisdiction, and for example, I know that in France, you can
Sorry,
never...
we're talking about Russia.
Yeah, but just for your fun fact, I would say that, for example, in Russia, we can use stuff we found on social media for report, but in France, you cannot without the consent. Speaking about also the kind of evidence that you would use in court, or the kind of evidence that you would that would differ from the evidence you would use to dismiss a person internally. So I would say in most of the cases we deal with, it doesn't go to court because the company doesn't want publicity about that we had a fraud. So now everyone knows it. The usual thing or approach is to do it internally and just dismiss this person. And it becomes more difficult if you go to court, but I know that this kind of evidence is accepted. To my best knowledge, I think you can.
Yeah, so for the actual techniques that you would use to collect the information, it's all forensically sound. So anything that's collected would be admissible in court. And it comes down to things like you have date stamps on the devices themselves, so it will tell you when the data has been collected, where it was collected from, and it's very difficult to argue with it. So the individual may say, you've produced this document, but the actual factual evidence will show that that's not the case. And I do agree with Oleg, very few of the cases that we get involved in ever end up with in court or with the police or with regulators, because companies just don't want that to happen. So for example, if it's a corruption case, we showed the list of fines that people get and the costs that are associated with that. So companies might have a corruption case, but they don't want anybody to know about it, because if somebody knows about it, then it gets investigated by the regulator, they get fined. So the reality of it is, for us, is that's typically why we're brought into a lot of cases, is companies want us to do an independent investigation, give them the results, and then they will either dismiss the person, or most often actually in Russia, they don't dismiss the person, they pay them to go away. So some form of settlement, that's normal. Yeah.
Just a minute.
So it's incentive.
It's very often, that's exactly what happens. And I think there are people that have done this at like maybe 2, 3, 4 different companies, and they know that if they get caught, the actual reality of something happening to them that's a problem to them is not high. And I'd say maybe 60, 70% of the cases I've done in Russia, that's exactly what's happened, is they've been paid to go away.
And any other questions? Thank you very much.
I have a small request. I just noticed that people on that part got maps and people on that part got brochures. There is a pile of both brochures and maps. Collect what.
Thank you very much. And I sent presentation, and I have a little present for our speakers from ACCA. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Алин, собери, пожалуйста, бейджи And now, our favorite part of event, little gift from company Control Risk. Tell us about book.
So Tatiana asked me to advise some book on fraud, forensics, investigations, and I said there is no such book to her, and in Russian actually, and a good one that you can buy in Moscow. So I said let's just present a mug of control risks, not a book. But then I searched around the city, trying to access all of the bookshops we have, and found actually one, and that I recommended to Tatiana. So that's the big story about it.
And our gift, Jonathan, please. Only one page from back.
Oh, okay.
No.
From here. I can't read that.
It's Konstantin Malachov. Вы обладатели единственной книги про финансовые расследования. Ура! Thank you very much, and I'll send for you our presentation, and thank you very much for company Control Risk. Thank you.